Okay, we're on. Sorry for the small delay. My usual computer issues. Okay, so we'll just jump right in. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. That perspective or that view beginning with some definition. Um, the Buddha talked about right view and wrong view, samaditi, michaditi, and the false views and michaditis are analyzed in great detail in Digha Nikaya 1, the Brahmajala Sutta, but elsewhere the the classification is usually given in a much simpler form as being either uh, annihilationism, which is a usual translation, or eternalism, that's Uchedawada or Sasatawada. Uchedawada literally means the cutting off view, and it's the named such because the one of the tenets is that when a being dies, um, he is cut off absolutely, that the elements return to earth, air, fire, water, and the consciousness just ceases to exist, and that there really is nothing real except the four elements. And of course, this view has gained a lot of prominence in modern times, and for many people in the world uh, would hold to this view in one form or another. It's considered by modern people to be the rational scientific view, although it's not. It's kind of a curiosity that it's less dogmatically held by physicists than other branches of science. It seems like the biologists currently tend to be the most materialistic. The idea for a materialist is that nothing exists except matter, and it has a long pedigree. The Buddha wouldn't have mentioned it if there hadn't been materialist thinkers in ancient India, and we see it in classical Western civilization as well. A famous exponent would be Lucretius, who promoted an atomic view that's often associated with Stoicism. Recall who defined it this way. It was one of the European thinkers defined it as nothing exists except matter in motion, and that mind or consciousness ends up being just a result of physical processes. In the modern iteration, this is often attributed to activity in the brain, although you'll find some neuroscientists who will say that consciousness itself cannot be explained this way, or at least they'll all admit it hasn't been explained this way. But nevertheless, this view remains very persistent. I'd like to highlight a few of the problems with this view. First of all, from the point of view of Buddhist philosophy, one of the central tenets of Buddhist thought is the dependent origination, that nothing arises without a cause. And this is expanded to say nothing arises from a cause, and nothing arises from nothing arises without a cause, and nothing arises from a single cause. So it becomes the interdependence of all things. So Buddhist thought right from the beginning doesn't admit for any randomness or arbitrariness, and materialism has to fall back in the end on a kind of randomness. Things are just the way they are because that's the way they are. Sometimes this is expressed in probabilistic terms, but nevertheless, there's a randomness inherent in the physicalist or materialist view. You could also see quite a few problems with taking a materialist position philosophically, and I would highly recommend the writer Bernardo Kastrup, who has written extensively on his own philosophy of idealism, which is not quite the Buddhist view, but as part of his writing, he deals with various reasons why the materialist view is untenable, particularly from the point of view of things that he cites are cases of people who have either near-death experiences or a very severe brain injury, and their brain function is highly compromised in either case, but their experience, their subjective experience, can be quite lucid and complex. And there's many cases in the literature of this. So with a reduced brain function, the imaginations and creations of the brain are increased. So this is curious. For my way of thinking, I hold that the strongest the strongest argument against materialism is the non-algorithmic nature of consciousness. Most of our other mental processes, the various mental formations that we manipulate, and even to some degree sanyak, or can be explained or explicated in terms of algorithm that is reduced to a stepwise process. And this is how computers work, and artificial intelligence. Now we have very impressive AI systems that could certainly pass the old Turing test. For those who are not familiar with it, the Turing test was a thought experiment created by the computer pioneer Alan Turing before the real dawn of the computer age. He was thinking about software issues before there was even hardware to run his programs. And he said that we could consider a computer to be have reached intelligence when its responses are indistinguishable from those of a human being. So if you have a human communicating and asking questions and having a chat as we do with Chat GPT or any of the others, and the computer answers, and the person is unable to distinguish in a blind test between that and the case of another human sitting at another keyboard answering these questions. I think that the modern AI reaches that standard, but that's not that could be considered intelligence in a sense, but it's not consciousness. There's no conscious awareness in the computer. And I don't think, personally, I very much doubt there ever will be, because for it to be reduced into an iteration of software, the process of consciousness would have to be algorithmic. But consciousness is not a stepwise process. It just simply is. We are simply aware of things. We have experience, which no machine has, or even theoretically, I don't think ever could have. It's purely organic experience. So, so if consciousness is not reducible to an algorithm, then it cannot be produced by a physical process, whether it's computer chip neurons or clockwork. These are all forms of a kind of physical processes that could be considered mechanical. And consciousness just is. It arises and takes an object. So what we have is something called the mind-body problem, the relationship of mind and body. And in modern times, that's pretty much reduced to brain-mind problem, because we tend to see all mental processing is happening in the brain. And to a large degree, that's probably accurate. But I think we have to consider what is the real function and nature of brain. What does the brain actually do? What's its connection to mental life? And certainly there is obviously a connection, because various damages to the brain will affect your cognition and perception in quite radical ways. But I think it's a delusion to think that brain produces consciousness or creates consciousness somehow, that it's prior to consciousness. The natural tendency, I think, for many modern people is to use an analogy for the operation of brain, comparing it to a computer. And this is understandable. This is our, computers are our pride and joy. They're the sort of the current limit or iteration of human ingenuity, and we relate to the operation of a computer, and many people have lesser or greater understanding of how that operation works, and they read it over into the brain. I think that's misleading. I don't think the brain in large part operates like a computer at all. If we are going to use a technological metaphor or analog for the brain, I would prefer to think of the brain as a radio receiver, that the brain is the interface between mind and body. We have obviously a correlation between certain firings of neurons and certain thought patterns. But there's no a priori reason to assume that the arrow of causation is the neurons cause the thought. It may be that the thought determines which neurons will fire. And the system works the other way around. I came up with a parable once of to illustrate this idea. Assume there was some primitive tribe living on an island isolated from the rest of the world, and they never saw any technology of modern technology, and there was a shipwreck somewhere nearby, and a crate washed up on shore that contained a battery powered radio. And when they turned it on and playing with it, they accidentally turned it on and were amazed to hear voices and music and so on. The logical assumption for them would be to assume that the box somehow produced these sounds in some mysterious way. It would seem far-fetched that when they heard music, that there was in some distant city there was someone playing tapes, and radio waves were transpiring across space and being picked up. That would be less likely to occur to them. And they might even try, and if they had some members of their tribe who were clever and had a inquisitive mind, they may even try figuring out how this works by doing experiments, taking the back off the radio receiver and playing with the dials and the wires inside, disconnecting a wire and seeing that, okay, that everything now is gone. But if I disconnect this wire, then I lose only the high frequency sounds. So they could map out which parts of the circuit board produce these different effects. It would always be an incomplete explanation, but it would seem like they were on the right track. It would seem convincing. So I think there's other points that could be brought out regarding the philosophical basis and of materialism and why it ultimately fails. But I'd also like to examine the results or implications of holding a physicalist view. One is that, and there have been, let me preface this by saying that there have been, in recent decades, there have been some individual writers and speakers who try and present a kind of Buddhist philosophy that's founded on materialism, and with the result that, first of all, there's no such thing as rebirth. But I think more, and that's often how the argument is phrased, but I think a more important point is, if materialism were true, then there's no third noble truth. There's no release from suffering. There's no nibbana. Because by saying materialism is material processes are the only reality, then you're saying that the conditioned world is all that there is. There's no possible transcendence beyond this conditioned world. So you're taking per force, you're taking the third noble truth out of Buddhism. There's no way of having a materialist view and holding to the possibility of transcendence. If we're just machines made out of meat, then there's no real liberation for us. The best that one could hope for in that scenario would be peace of mind and happiness in the here and now. And it would always be limited. It would still be within conditioned existence. There's also, I think, practical problem in that the basis for morality becomes very much weakened. If there's no results of good and evil deeds, then it takes away one of the major, and this is more of a social question than a personal or spiritual issue. But if people generally believe only in materialism, then there's going to be necessarily a degeneration in morality. That there will be less incentive to do good and abstain from evil, which is not to say that there aren't some atheistically minded people who behave morally, but I think as a general trend, there would be less reason to do so. It would seem that if materialism were true and there were only this life and there were no such thing as karma or result of karma, then the rational thing for any person to do would be to try and maximize their personal pleasure in this existence. There wouldn't seem to be any reason not to. And one kind of peripheral consideration I wanted to bring up, as I was thinking about it, that relates to this issue of materialism, is to do with Western philosophy. Now, as a bit of a way of preface to my remarks, I'll say that very often controversies and issues that come up in Western philosophy don't map over very well into the Indian or specifically Buddhist approach. They often not quite, the questions that they ask are not quite what the East would ask, and because of underlying assumptions are different. But there's still of interest if we bear that in mind, that it can't, Western controversies like free will versus determinism don't really play over exactly into the Buddhist way of thinking, although they can have parallels. Now, what I want to look at is what's generally considered now to be an obscure and obsolete controversy from the European Middle Ages between the nominalists and the realists. They were the two big schools of thought in the European Middle Ages. And I'm bringing this in because of something I read in a little book by the Russian philosopher Alexander Dugin, who's quite a quirky and interesting thinker. And he makes a big issue out of this, that it still plays. He thinks it's that the old controversy still has some bearing today. The nominalists and the realists were the two main schools of thought, and to some degree they owe their origins to Aristotle and Plato, but not entirely. But they kind of follow those trends. And the names are a little bit misleading to the modern mind. At first look, they seem to be opposite of what you would expect. Um, the question is whether abstract notions like truth and beauty and justice and so on, that of course a lot of Plato's dialogue centered around defining these terms, whether those sorts of concepts are real. That would be the realist view. So the realists are more, in modern terms, more idealistic, or whether these terms, abstract terms, are just names, just designations, just purely artificial. And that's the nominalist view. They're just names, they're just nominal. And for most of the Middle Ages, the realist view held sway. But then towards the end of the period, the nominalists began to take over. And Dugin's contention is that the switch from realism to nominalism is the root of all the problems that the world has faced since. That this switch in philosophy led to, by logical extension, it led to a radical egotism. Right? Nothing is real outside of the individual. And all concepts like truth and justice and so on are purely conventional, and there's no there's no essential reason to uphold them. They're just matters of definition that can change and shift. So we have gradually seen society becoming more and more frayed and chaotic, and we have the kind of postmodern view that could be seen as an extension of that there's no ultimate truth. The truth is only personal, individual. My truth is different from your truth. There's no ultimate truth that is ultimate reality behind everything. I think there's something to that, and he also, and this is where it ties into materialism, that Dugin says that this also leads to what he calls a mechanistic view of human nature and of reality, and of society. That there's no that everything is kind of a mechanism. That there's no intrinsic value in anything. I think you can see that, and of course, this mechanism is a form of materialism, and this is philosophically, this comes out of both from this nominalist trend, but also from the atomistic views of Lucretius that were rediscovered in the Renaissance. Although some, I would say that there's a counter view that the text of Lucretius that was discovered in the Renaissance was actually a forgery, and it represented a 16th century writer pretending to be an ancient Hellenistic writer. But nevertheless, it became a popular view in intellectual circles. It denied all spiritual potential in human beings, that were just atoms in motion. And it led to the moral view that anything goes, that there's no real right or wrong. It's all arbitrary or conventional. I think this abandonment of ultimate value does lead to chaos, and it leads to anti-human and anti-human behavior and attitudes. And this is, I think, we can see practical examples of this in the widespread acceptance of abortion and euthanasia, that life is less valued in this system. This is only a machine. After all, if the machine is inconvenient or malfunctioning or not wanted, just dispose of it. But I think the kind of also, maybe I'll finish with this. I think the trend now may be turning. The wheel may be turning in intellectual history, and the reign of materialism and mechanism and nominalism may be coming to an end and shifting. And I think one of the underlying causes of this, that's taking a century to really play out into the broad consciousness, is quantum mechanics. Physics in the 19th century was very much Lucretian. The universe is made of these hard little billiard ball atoms that whose behavior is entirely predictable. So it's also a deterministic view. There's no freedom in the universe of these billiard ball atoms. If you could know all the initial conditions, then you could predict anything that could happen. And consciousness has no place in this system. Consciousness is, at best, a result of complex interplay of atoms. But then you have, beginning in the shortly after the turn of the 1900s, you had various experiments in physics that were coming into curious new dimensions, and finding things didn't quite work that way, and it became more and more impossible to take consciousness out of the equation. You have the observer effect, that a particle of light can either manifest as a particle or as a wave, depending on how you look at it. And now, with quantum mechanics, there's some pretty strong general agreement on the mathematical expression of it, but then to try and understand it on a level of, what does this mean? It leads to different interpretations, and they're not uniform. But the most straightforward interpretation is what became known as the Copenhagen school, is that reality exists as a probability wave, and only becomes manifest as something when it's observed. So there's no possible way of taking consciousness out of the equation. And reality becomes something not of hard billiard balls, but a very fuzzy field of potentialities. And this idea of the probability field seems to me to be very parallel to the Buddhist idea of sunyata, of the emptiness, the voidness, which is not an empty annihilation type of void, but is a potential. And Tibetans compare it to a womb. which is an empty space but has the potential of giving birth. That when things are void, they're infinitely potential. They could be anything. Anything could manifest, anything could happen. But then once an object, a Dhamma, is perceived by consciousness, then it's manifest. It's no longer has that infinite potential, and it now is dukkha. It's suffering because it's a broken bit. It's not a total reality. So I think, in the future we may see the gradual shifting away of thinking away from materialism. I think its heyday of materialism may be drawing to an end. So I'll stop there, and I see the chat is full of comments or questions. Let me just scroll it back here and see. Oh boy, there's lots. I don't know how many I'll get through. Let's have a look here. I have to expand the font. My old eyes can't read that little thing. Okay. Greetings from Poland. It's 11 p.m. for me. I always listen to before I fall asleep. Thank you for your effort. Oh, I'm glad to hear from you. Sorry for being so late, but it's very difficult to find a time that works for everybody. Oh, people are telling me the live stream was kind of choppy. Yeah, I did notice my video was freezing now and again briefly, so I hope the replay will be understandable. I don't know. What about brain as just a receiver, then an exact biological copy of body turning in the same way as we do? What do you think the idea when thinking about biological clones instead of robots? I don't know. A clone would still be a new being. There would have to be a rebirth into the clone, so the mind would not be exactly the same. If time is not really real and the reality is sunyata, what is outside of the boundaries of space and time? Could this be inferred that it would be possible to take birth in another time, like a distant past or future, not following the ordinary linear fashion? Yeah, I couldn't say positively about that. There's a couple of points I could cite that work both ways on that question. One is that when we have stories in the canon and commentary about individual rebirths, it always follows a linear time-wise fashion. And we don't see stories about people being reborn into different world systems, which I've found a kind of interesting detail. But on the other hand, it's quite clear that time does not work the same on different realms, like in the Dewa realm and the Brahma realm. When we talk about Brahmas and Devas living for millions of years or kapas of time, there also seems to be some apparent contradiction here and there about in the relationships between when Devas manifest on the earth and so on, that the timing doesn't seem to be the same, and it's possible that they just don't relate. You just can't, like millions of years may go by in a Dewa realm, and it might be just a very brief period out here on the earth. So it's not time is not a fixed thing. Well, this would be this would be quite acceptable in Einsteinian physics, that time is not a fixed thing. It's dependent, it's relative. Have you read of any Ian McGilchrist writings? Yes. Yeah. Thank you for asking that. Yeah, I read his first book, The Master and Emissary, and I've started in on it on The Matter with Things. I'm about 200 pages into it. It's like I think about 1,200 pages or something. It's a huge book. I don't know how long it'll take me to get through it. Yeah, he's very interesting, and um, I don't know if how many people would have caught this in the introduction to Master and Emissary. You know, he does address the mind brain problem, and he says that he doesn't weigh in on it either way uh, explicitly, but he did say that nothing. I can't. I'm only paraphrasing from memory. I can't remember exactly how he phrased it. It was like a very cautious kind of statement, something like nothing that we know about the brain and its functioning would seem to indicate that consciousness is necessarily arising from brain, something like that. Like he's open, at least open to a non-physicalist interpretation. And then when you read further into his work, I get the strong impression that he's not a physicalist or materialist, but he doesn't really want to be explicit about that. Possibly because he would lose credibility with scientific colleagues. Okay, yeah, I would recommend his books, Ian McGilchrist. He's also got some interviews and things up on YouTube, and he's actually quite a charming speaker. Also, since time's an illusion, has everything, all possibilities could ever happen in all possible shapes and forms, at all possible spatial and temporal positions already happened. Now, this is an interesting idea because we couldn't rule that out because if the universe is indeed infinite, both in space and in time, which the Buddha refused to comment on. Let's be clear about that. He was asked, "Is the universe endless?" And he said that was one of the Abhyakadadhammas. He said that's a question that cannot be answered. But Buddhaghosa and the tradition after him were quite explicit. Buddhaghosa says the universe is without limit; it's boundless, and time is beginningless, without origin and ending. So yeah, so if there's an infinity of time and space, everything that could happen probably has happened. I once saw a video by Goenka titled Buddha the Super Scientist, and I agree with that statement because the Buddha took into consideration all aspects of reality. Yes, I haven't seen that video, but that sounds kind of interesting. I'm sorry, this is kind of jumping around on me. Okay, do you think that modern science considers mainly materialism as true and real? Um, as I said, I think that's becoming that has been the position generally, and I think from a historical point of view, I think it made sense. Science had to take that view in order to progress. When you consider where it started from, it came, Western science came from uh, really from the its first embryonic beginnings of what we would call modern science in the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance period, in an atmosphere when the church was dominant and you could always explain any natural phenomenon by saying God did it. So if you take God out of the equation and you have to explain things without a God, then you have to look for physical causes. And uh, it it took 400 or 500 years to come up to the limitations of that view and see it as problematic from within its own system. This is where once you hit quantum mechanics, then the purely materialist or physicalist view begins to break down. And I think that's taken quantum mechanics is now 100 years old, and it's taken that long for it to really work its way into the intellectual matrix um, of the educated classes. Next, Ajahn, when we move in space, are we constantly vanishing from current location and reappearing in adjacent location as fast as we can perceive? Is space also an illusion? That is the Abhidhamma position. The theory in Abhidhamma is that a Dhamma only, which is a ultimate unit of reality, only exists for a moment, and it ceases in the same place where it arose. So that what we perceive as motion is actually subsequent arising in adjacent locations. Does the world have a frame rate, something like Planck's constant for space and time? Also, according to Abhidhamma, yes, there is and it's very. You bring up the Planck's constant. It's very much like that. That there is a intrinsically very an infinitesimally small moment that can't be subdivided. That's a unit, like a unit of time, just as there's a unit of space. Now there was a controversy around this in early Buddhism. Different schools of Buddhism held different interpretations of the momentariness of a Dhamma, which is really a central principle of Abhidhamma, is the momentary existence of reality. The Theravada view was that a Dhamma actually does persist for a very brief unit of time. That would be, maybe not numerically, but conceptually equivalent to a Planck moment. This is it. This is a moment. But other schools held that the moment was actually a true mathematical infinitesimal. This is the basis of calculus, right? That what they call an instant or an infinitesimal is a moment in time that has no duration, just like a point is a location in space that has no extension. So this is a philosophical issue that they had at the time. Yeah. I found out that it's absolutely necessary to believe in nothing. Shunro Suzuki. Yeah, okay. I like the slogan, is nothing sacred? Well, as a matter of fact, it is. This is one of the first videos of Ajahn Punnadhammo that I just can't agree with. Okay, you don't have to agree with everything I say. It just means you're wrong. No, I'm kidding. No, think for yourself. Is it wrong to think that karma is personally owned by an individual? Rather, is karma an impersonal force which perpetuates rebirth? Well, see, this again is a question that has a wrong preposition behind it, because you're talking about an individual, so there's kind of a implication of a self, of an entity that owns the karma, rather than just as an impersonal process going on. It's just cause and effect. Are all paramis considered equal to reach stream entry, or can perfecting some make up for the rest? No, you don't have to perfect all the paramis even to become an arhat. It's only a Buddha that has perfected all the paramis. But the more you develop the paramis, the more it'll take you along. But to to have all 10 paramis 100% perfected, that's the definition of Buddhahood. Okay, relation between imperfect sila and samasamadhi. Can someone who occasionally breaks the 5 precepts, for example, drinking alcohol and using curse words, but otherwise follows the rest of the precepts, be able to get into a samadhi state? Um, yeah, I don't think minor violations of the precept completely uh, eliminate the possibility of samadhi or even jhana, but they make it more difficult. And if they're habitual or major violations, then it closes the door. Is there any practice or meditation method a layperson can do to recognize and understand the mind or mental plane? Yeah, quick answer: vipassana. Okay, I think I'll stop there. That's getting close to a full hour, so I'll end the stream now. And I think now this week I did materialism. I think I'll have to tackle the other end of the spectrum next week and talk about eternalism. So thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you later.